Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be once again talking about the possibly longest short-lived comic book series in the history of comics with Battle Chasers #1. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in April of 1998, we can see here on the cover it's featuring Calibretto and Red Monica, who we will meet in this issue, and also Gully, who we met in the preview comic. Now, if you haven't watched my video on the Battle Chasers preview comic, I suggest you do because it gives a lot of context to some of the story points that are happening in this issue. Also, this is not the standard cover for this issue. There are 3 separate covers that exist for this issue. One by Joe Madureira. I forget the artist who did the 3rd cover, and this cover is done by one Travis Charest or Charest. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but I do want to point out, I actually had to look that up. I mean, he did sign it here and it does say Travis, but in terms of him being credited inside of the book with all the rest of the people who worked on it, he's not, which I find really strange that, you wouldn't credit the artist for one of the variant covers for a book. Seems like a really strange choice to make when you're publishing. And also, as I stated, Battle Chasers is definitely one of the longest short-lived series to have ever existed. Obviously, it took roughly 25 years for Joe Madureira to complete a total of 12 issues plus a preview comic, so like 12 and a half issues. And that's really kind of unacceptable in most cases. I mean, shockingly enough, he did finish the story, but still, like 25 years to put out 12 issues? Like, that's pretty, like, come on, man, get it together. Joe Madureira and Munir Shaharif story. Joe Madureira, pencils. Tom McWeeny, inks. Liquid, colors. Richard Starkings and Comicraft. Oh my gosh, this is so hard to read. Letters and Comicraft design. My goodness, why would you use such small fonts? We see here on the first page a eerie setting where a bunch of men are standing around looking down into an open grave where a condemned man lies and a mask is lowered onto his face. This, of course, is a dream that is being had by one Nolan, and it states that his dream is the same every night, but it's been changing recently as the screams have gotten louder, and he can no longer make out the faces of the other men in the dream. As he looks around, he starts to wonder where his friend Calibretto is at, because the fire needs more wood, and apparently he expects Calibretto to do all that for him and won't lift a finger to do it on his own. Also, this is our first introduction to Nolan. He is a wizard and or mage that we will be seeing more of as the story progresses. We're then treated to this 2-page splash image where we see that Gully is still on the run, being chased by the werewolves who killed her nanny and the royal guard that was supposed to be protecting them. She, of course, is trying to retreat along with the box that was given to her by Nanny. She still has no idea what the contents of the box are, but she was told no matter what to guard it with her life and not let the monsters get a hold of it. And she's taken that to heart as she continues to sprint through the forest during a stormy night and thinks to herself, I won't let them get it. As we see Gully continuing to run through the forest, we notice that whoever is behind her is getting closer. As she turns around and gasps to see a werewolf right on her heels, the wolf clamps down on her cloak and pulls her around with his mouth, throwing her and slamming her against a tree, but she refuses to let go of the box and states that she won't hand it over. Also, I'd like to point out that you'll notice Gully's actually being drawn to look a fair bit older in these sequences, and this is something that Joe changes about halfway through this book. Gully's only supposed to be like around 12 years old, but you can see here her face in these panels sort of resembles that of like a late teen, maybe early 20s adult woman, and he definitely changes her features later on to try and make her appear more childlike in the latter pages of this book. We then get an advertisement for 1080 snowboarding on the N64. And I'll admit, I was never really a fan of this game. I always felt like it was a bit overrated. Not necessarily because it's intention or it's bad in any way. It's more so the fact that I was expecting it to be a game that was about like snowboarding and doing tricks and stuff, when in reality, it's more of like a racing game that happens to involve snowboarders. And you can do tricks, but the game is focused more so around racing than it is actual snowboard tricks, which I always thought was just like an odd choice. But then again, it sold really well, so what the hell do I know? We then get an advertisement for Batman the Animated Series that's going to start playing on Cartoon Network. Of course, this is, in 1998, but I do find it pretty strange that they took out a full-page ad in a comic book to be like, hey, that animated series that was on Fox that was really great? Well, we're going to have the reruns of it now on Cartoon Network. It just seems like, wow, you're putting a lot of money into advertising that you're going to be re-airing something that's already finished at this point. But, whatever, it worked out for him, I'm sure. Batman the Animated Series is fantastic, and I have no doubt that it got great ratings on Cartoon Network. Back to the story, we see Gully as she slams against the trunk of the tree and then falls down onto the ground, looking like she's been hurt, and still states, "I won't let you get it." At this point, the werewolves make their key mistake, as one of them just says, "Then run." Why would you let her go? I mean, I understand from the story aspect of you're not going to kill off the central character of your entire story in the very first issue. However, this pack of werewolves has her surrounded and are all carrying weapons, and she's a child who's never been in a real fight before. Like, all you have to do is get this box, and that was your task, and you could take it from her right now. You don't even have to kill her if you don't want to, but they're like, nah, man, we're going to keep going with this chase. That'll be fun. So, of course, they let her go as we see Gully start tromping through the forest once again. She reaches the edge of the forest and then notices the town of Grannock, which apparently was destroyed by a flood earlier on and is now completely uninhabited. And she's hoping she can find somewhere to hide amongst the abandoned buildings to buy herself some time and perhaps even escape the werewolves. Gully finds a place to hide inside one of the buildings and ducks down as one of the wolves passes by the window. Gully lets out a gasp and believes that she may have given them the slip as she peers out the window. Unfortunately, she didn't even come close to escaping them as one of the wolves blasts through the wall of the building she's in and says, "My, what big eyes you have," which is okay, fine. Gully thinks that she's going to have to fight at this point and scaredly picks up a pickaxe, or tries to, and states, "Don't make me hurt you," as she realizes that this pickaxe is far too heavy for her to lift. However, it's also quite rotted as we see the head of the pickaxe snap off and Gully's left holding just the handle. At this point, the werewolf thinks that he has the upper hand and states that he wants the box. But once again, Gully remains defiant as she stabs the broken handle of the pickaxe directly into his neck and then takes off up a pile of boxes to jump out of a window as the lead werewolf states to chase her down but not kill her because he wants that for himself, as Gully starts to run off into the forest once again. As Gully continues to run into the forest, the werewolves taunt her, stating they're going to kill her the same way that they killed her father. She, however, refuses to believe that her father is dead, and in her panic does not see the large figure in front of her in the darkness and runs square into him, dropping the box. The figure then picks up the box and stands very, very menacingly almost over her, and she once again remains defiant, stating, "Give it back. Why are you doing this? What have you done with my father?" And, she just demands that he answers her. However, he says nothing and lifts his hand. She believes that this is an attack directed at her when he unleashes 3 small cannonballs, striking the werewolf that was leaping at Gully, trying to kill her. Gully realizes that this figure is not working with the werewolves now and decides that she can start to trust him. She asks, who he is or what's going on. However, before he can give an answer, he's struck in the back by 3 arrows from a werewolf that is perched up in a tree. Gully believes that the man is in imminent danger and tells him to run. However, instead of that, the man pops up a laser guided, apparently, flamethrower as we see the beam of light sticking out of it, and then a torrent of flame just burst out of the end of the barrel. The werewolf, however, dodges the attack and lunges at the figure, stating that he's unimpressed as he leads with his knife. However, the figure is much quicker than he appears as he reaches one hand out and grabs the werewolf by the face and catches him in midair, which is a pretty cool move. The figure then takes the werewolf and smashes his head to the ground, lifting his other fist ready to deliver a strike. However, at this moment, a bolt of lightning strikes his fist and completely electrifies him, and also disintegrates the tunic that he's wearing as we see the electricity coursing all over his body. At this point, we get our first good look at the figure and realize that this is no man. This is some sort of weird mechanical being that is covered in different hoses and gears, but it still has a human-like figure. The unknown figure states, "Hey, stay back. I've got to do something," as Gully looks on in complete awe of what she's seeing. Also, this is a really cool image. I do like this full page splash here of who we know obviously is Calibretto. But this is our first introduction to, really seeing him as a whole and getting an idea for just how big he really is. We then get a 2-page advertisement for Batman and Robin on the PlayStation. I've never played this game, but I've watched enough videos about it to know it's not great. Unfortunately, this is not really entirely on the development team. Of course, they were pressed for time because they wanted this game to coincide with the release of the movie, but also they kind of just shot for the stars and sort of missed. Batman and Robin was supposed to be like a full-fledged open world game that took place in like 26 square miles of Gotham City. And that was a really ambitious concept to try and pull off on the original PlayStation. And it just didn't really have the power necessary to be able to do that. But the concept of what they were trying to do was sound, as we would see 2 full console generations later when Batman Arkham City released, which is exactly, for the most part, what they were trying to accomplish with this game. I got to give them credit for being really forward thinking. Unfortunately, when you try to push the envelope too much, it tends to just rip and you kind of fall flat on your face. We then see Calibretto raise his hand up as he instructs Gully to get behind him quickly. He must release. We then see his arm start to transform as parts of it start to hiss and pop out. The werewolves decide that they need to make their assault here as they realize they've just encountered a war golem and that he by himself will be worth his weight in gold along with what they're getting paid to retrieve the box. They all charge forward in their attack as we see Calibretto shove his hand directly into the ground and then release the full energy of the lightning bolt that he just absorbed, which completely vaporizes all the werewolves. Gully, still a little bit frazzled and not understanding what she saw, asks him, "Did you just absorb that lightning bolt?" Calibretto responds by saying, "We must take cover. I won't survive that again." Meanwhile, we're then teleported to the town of Vandalheim, which is essentially kind of like Tortuga in a sense. It's kind of this world's home for rogues and thieves and ne'er-do-wells. We see a figure opening the door of the Death's Door Saloon, and everyone inside stopping their conversations and merrymaking as they all seem to be a little bit taken back by who just walked in, as that figure slowly approaches a man drowning his sorrows in the bottom of a beer mug and wants to give him a little bit of a proposition. It's at this point we get our first introduction to Monica, aka Red Monica, as she is here to recruit the man at the table by the name of Garrison. Garrison, however, is not impressed as he tells her to simply go away. Monica completely ignores him, however, sits down at the table and tells him that she's accepted a job to free a terrorist from the impenetrable prison known as Skyhold, and that she wants Garrison to accompany her in this mission. She states that all she needs is his blade in case things get out of hand, and that she has a full layout of the blueprints of this entire prison and has a schedule of when all the guard shift changes are, and that basically everything's under control. She just wants him for a little bit of extra insurance, and she wonders how her proposition goes and says, "So what do you say? Are you going to help me out or what?" Also, I love the fact that Monica's wearing, armor. However, the armor is not at all covering her chest, and her heart is fully exposed. Not like that's a vital organ you'd want to protect or anything. We then get a 2-page ad for Crimson. And now, admittedly, I know very little about Crimson, basically almost nothing other than its existence. I've seen, little bits and pieces of, Crimson artwork. Also, a buddy of mine who used to own a comic book shop bought a statue collection from a guy one time who had a lot of Crimson mini busts. I don't know how rare those actually are or how desirable they are. Probably pretty desirable if you're a big fan of Crimson. That being said, I'm hoping one day that I can find all of Crimson in a set. It seems interesting enough that I'd like to read through it and do some videos on it. And, fingers crossed I'll come across it one day. Garrison, however, just laughs and states that, Monica's surely out of her mind if she thinks that they're somehow going to get into Skyhold. However, the men accompanying Monica seem to be rather angry at his mocking of their leader, as one of them even draws a blade. However, Monica stops him and says there's no sense in, ending the life of a drunken has-been. As Garrison takes another sip of his ale, he simply states, sticks and stones. However, at this point, Monica starts to lose it as she smacks the glass straight out of his hand and says, is this really what your life has become? Then why don't you just end it? As she slams a dagger down into the table. She tells Garrison to go ahead and do it and then go to hell, but Garrison just hangs his head and thinks to himself, I'm already there. Meanwhile, back with Gully and Calibretto, they found a shelter to inhabit for the night and get out of the bad weather. Gully tries to break open the box, but unfortunately gives up and realizes that she's incapable of snapping the latch and is really worried about what the contents of this box actually are. Calibretto informs her, however, that the box is sealed with magic and that she'll never be able to break the seal on her own. But he does in fact have a friend who may be able to help, named Nolan. Calibretto, as we see here, is trying to repair his arm after it got struck by lightning. He introduces himself formally to Gully, and, she starts to question him as to, why he helped her and what he was doing out in the forest that late at night to begin with. He states that he was actually trying to plant some seeds of a very rare plant that he's trying to bring back from the brink of extinction. But he then looks at Gully's face and says, "Is everything okay? Are you crying?" She then leans forward and hugs him, and he's actually quite shocked. Also, this is the point at which we see that Joe starts to draw Gully with more childlike features, which is fitting given that she is supposed to be a child. And it is kind of strange that he drew her the way he did in the earlier part of this book. We then get a close-up of Gully's face, seeing her sad expression as she begins to tell Calibretto what's happened to her this evening, explaining that she is indeed the daughter of Aramis, and that her home was invaded by these werewolves in disguise, and now they killed the royal guard that was supposed to protect her and Nanny, and then of course killed Nanny. And at this point, we realize that, Gully hasn't had any time to process the loss of a loved one and has no idea why this box is so important, what's inside of it, or why someone that she cared about so much had to die to try and protect it, as she's now been put in charge of doing that herself. Meanwhile, in another part of the forest, we see that one of the werewolves did manage to survive the onslaught by Calibretto as he limps through the forest trying to find his master. He does indeed find him, as his master states, "Where is the box? Give it to me." And the wolf has to very slowly and carefully explain that they ran into a war golem and that they were no match for him, as he killed all but this one werewolf. And He was only able to survive, luckily, and make it back to his master. He does, however, conveniently leave out the part where they had Gully completely cornered on her own, and they could have killed her and taken the box at any time they wanted to, but they instead let her go because they were sadistic. He then says that they'll need reinforcements to be able to handle this war golem. The man in the shadows with the glowing eyes states, "Very well, you'll have what you need, but don't fail me again." Meanwhile, back at the house that Nolan is staying in, we see him floating in midair, reading through a magical text that's also floating in midair. He's searching for a spell that can cure his insomnia. However, the book suddenly starts to turn its own pages to a map of all of the magical rifts along the land, and then suddenly catches on fire. Nolan is shocked to see that the map of the magical rifts is destroying itself, and he wonders what on earth is happening in this place. He then hears a large thunk at the door, and when he goes to it, he finds Calibretto. He wastes no time in scolding the mechanical man, stating, "Where have you been? I'm freezing. You should have had firewood ready to go." Again, Nolan seems fully capable of having been able to do all that himself, but he more or less just wanted Calibretto to do it for him. And on the next page, we just kind of get like a little breakdown of things that were going on around Image. We see some people who got married, Jim Lee and a guy named Ryan hanging out together. Also, an upcoming Resident Evil book. Nothing super crazy here, just a little bit of like, hey, this is what's going on behind the scenes with us, and here's some books that are coming up. We then get an advertisement for some comic book font catalogs, and I gotta be honest, this is the first time I've ever seen anything like this. I've definitely never seen anything since. This apparently was from Comicraft, and these catalogs were not cheap. The most expensive one here is $149, which in '98 was a good bit of money, and I really have to wonder how well these things actually sold. I can't imagine people would have been willing to spend a whole lot of money on this stuff when they can just make up fonts on their own. But then again, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this was a successful business, but I don't see how. We then jump back into the story as we see Calibretto hold out his hands and Gully's curled up asleep in them. He states that, she needs help with their box. Nolan tells Calibretto to get her by the fire and throw some wood on it and grab a blanket that they've got to warm her up. Later on, we see that Gully is kind of sitting on the floor, starting to warm up a little bit after a well-needed rest. And Nolan asks her, what all's been happening, what's been going on. And she explains to him everything that's happened and tells him that she needs a way to open the box, but it's sealed with magic, and wonders if there's anything that Nolan can do to help her. Nolan, of course, states, hey, what kind of wizard would I be if I couldn't undo a simple magical lock? And with a simple swipe of his finger, we see the box pop open. At this point, Gully rushes over to see what the contents are, but Nolan warns her to be careful, that they have no idea what might be inside. We then see a set of large gauntlets pop up out of the box and hover in midair, and Nolan immediately realizes that these are the gauntlets of Aramis, who, of course, is Gully's father, and Nolan wonders exactly what on earth is happening as we see the story is to be continued. We then get to the ramblings from the madhouse, which is just kind of like a rundown of things that Joe Madureira wants to talk about. However, one of the things I found kind of funny is that he takes a moment to credit Scott Dunbier, who was the editor-in-chief at Cliffhanger Comics at this time, as being the guy who really kind of holds their asses to the fire and makes sure they get stuff done on time, which insinuates that Scott Dunbier might be the worst editor-in-chief in history, given that it took 25 years to complete this 12-issue comic book. We then get an advertisement for Frank Frazetta Fantasy Illustrated, which I've never come across one of these, but if I did, I'd definitely buy it because it seems really cool, and I do very much enjoy Frank Frazetta's artwork and, his type of fantasy and whatnot. And this also contains a story by Joe Madureira, which makes me wonder if this is sort of like heavy metal, I guess, where there's a lot of different stories going on that aren't necessarily connected to one another. I could be wrong. I'm just guessing. As I stated, I've never seen one of these, but if I did, I'd certainly pick it up. We also then get an advertisement for Battle Chasers issue number 2, which, I understand they want to generate buzz and all, but you already have issue number 1 in your hand. The idea that they would waste an entire page of issue number 1 to advertise issue number 2 seems a little weird. You could have potentially sold that space to someone wanting to advertise a product and made a little bit more money, but, this was the decision they went with. And that was Battle Chasers number 1. Overall, I thought it was a pretty decent book. There's a few little parts about it that I thought were strange. Obviously, I thought it was weird that Gully was drawn to look older than she's supposed to be in the early part of the book. And I also felt like the way that the story just jumped straight into her running for her life through the forest seemed a little weird, given that if you missed out on the preview comic, you had no context for what the heck was even going on. Obviously, they do have the flashback sequence later on in the book that explains everything, but it's a really, jarring way to introduce the character who's basically central to the whole story. I don't really have a problem with the way that they introduce Monica and Garrison and the way that they allude to the fact that the two of them have a past. But we also don't really get much explanation as to what Nolan and Calabretto have going for them or why they're helping Gully or any of that, which is fine. That can be explained in later issues. One thing I did find really interesting, though, is having played the Battle Chasers RPG, which, if you've never played, is pretty fun if you like classic JRPG style RPGs. In that game, Calabretto is not the best physical attacker. He's more in a cleric style role. And in this issue, he's a powerhouse of an attacker and just dominates the whole squad of werewolves. So it seems a little weird that they would change that for the game, but whatever. I understand they had to put someone in the role of a cleric, so I guess it may as well be Calabretto, potentially. But at any rate, these are all just my opinions. You may have felt like this book was flawless or terrible. You may also hate the video game or think that they did nothing wrong with it. And if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.